Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I'm your host, Paul Rader. Today we're going to talk about midterm elections and their importance and what you may not know about them, and some historical data and what you can expect for this year. Presidential elections tend to get most of the attention in election commentary, and yes, it's for the highest office in the land, but just as critical are midterm elections, and they're named as such because they happen halfway between presidential elections. And it's vital not just because it is another chance to hold our elected officials accountable, but it is also often used by voters to let the sitting president know what they think of him while not being able to actually vote on him, and perhaps in the future, her. Notably, midterm elections often play out very differently than presidential elections, because while presidential elections tend to be more successful for the party of the presidential contest winner, midterms tend to be much harsher to the president's party, and that goes for both Democrats and Republicans. Now, the fact that midterms are usually unkind to the president's party may be well known, but much less discussed are the reasons why that is the case. So today we're going to talk about why midterms often play out that way, some noteworthy midterm results in history, what this all means for 2026, and so on. So let's get into it. First of all, why do midterms often hurt the president's party? Well, there are several arguments put out for why midterms are notoriously antagonistic to the sitting president's party. Some aren't that convincing, while others are clear or borne out by the data, though I'd argue two of them in particular are at work. And the first one is that the president is not on the ballot. So a lot of people, particularly motivated to vote for the president, won't come out. And you see that in large part due to if you compare the difference in turnout rates between the midterm and presidential election, midterms have a lot fewer voters showing up than presidential elections do. And you saw this in particular with Barack Obama in 2010 and 2014, and with Donald Trump himself in 2018. And sometimes you hear this referred to as the surge and decline theory, where the forces that work for a presidential year that drove these voters out to the polls then decrease considerably in the midterms. And also, the second factor that I'd point to is that anger and hatred are powerful tools in politics, and the party out of power is often more capable of harnessing that in the midterms, because some people will have soured on the current administration, and that's not just for now, that's for a lot of history. But also, voters in the president's party tend to get more complacent because they've already, quote unquote, won. Hey guys, we already took the White House. And sometimes they have the Congress, or at least one chamber of Congress. We got it, guys. We have the president. That's what matters. So a lot of those people don't show up to vote. Being out of power, though, means much fewer of your policies get enacted. And that tends to make people angry because they tend to not be heard because they're not the ones in power. Because when you're in power, apparently you don't have to really listen to people that think differently than you as much. And you see that through a lot of history. And some observers also would argue that midterms also see attempts by a small but significant portion of the electorate looking to, quote unquote, balance the scales between the parties. So they'll vote for the out of power party as a check against the president. Sometimes it's called a form of strategic voting. Now, there undoubtedly are relative few voters doing this, but I'm a bit skeptical of just how many of them do this balancing act. Though some studies from around 2010-ish suggest that balancing was going on for at least a few decades up to that point, both for federal and state level elections. But whether balancing is still going on, though, I haven't seen a study for that. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist. I just haven't seen it. But also, you have to rely on people saying that, oh yeah, I actually decided to vote against the party. Sometimes it's an assumption because, oh, well, suddenly a whole bunch of people voted against the president's party. Maybe a whole bunch of people changed their mind. Not necessarily. Some people who just didn't show up the previous time might have decided to come out now. But not everybody just votes according to their party. It is the most common predictor of how people are going to vote, but there will be some people that decide, you know what, I am going to vote for the other party as a check on the president's power. It does happen. I just don't know if there's really all that many people that do it. But I'll have to look into that some more to see if there's been any more recent studies on that. But now let's look at the House versus the Senate when it comes to midterm elections. Now, midterms are unkind to the president's party, regardless of whether you're looking at it through the lens of the U.S. House or the U.S. Senate. But how unsuccessful the sitting president's party is can look much different in the House versus the Senate, because only a third of the U.S. Senate is up for election, and the whole House is up for election every time. Because remember, U.S. senators have 6-year terms, so one time they'll be during a presidential election, and then the next time they're up for election, it's going to be during a midterm, and it's going to go back to president, midterm for that same specific seat. So also the Senate is a much smaller chamber than the House is. So each seat in the Senate is mathematically more consequential than a seat in the House. And policy-wise, senators have a lot more power, and they also represent a whole state, as opposed to, for most U.S. House representatives, they represent a fraction of their state, unless you live in one of those states that only has one U.S. House representative. And so the number of seats held by the president's party in the Senate can vary considerably depending on what seats are up for election. So if a Republican president is in office at the time, there may just happen to not be as many Republican seats up in that election, or maybe there are a lot more that are up for that election. Remember, it's because of those 6-year terms, it can look much different depending on whether it's a presidential year or a midterm year, and when that seat just happens to be up. Now, does the party or the president's party fare worse in the House or the Senate? That depends on how you look at the information. But since 1934, the president's party in the U.S. House has had a net loss in seats in 20 of those midterms, while it had gains in only 3 of them. That was under FDR in 1934, Bill Clinton in 1998, and George W. Bush in 2002. And there was an average loss of 11% of seats that president's party held in those elections. For the U.S. Senate, since 1934, the president's party had a net loss in seats in 15 midterms, while it had gains in 7 of them. And they lost an average of about 15% of seats in the U.S. Senate that they held. Remember, there are far fewer seats that are up for election in the U.S. Senate than there are in the U.S. House. So those Senate seats are mathematically much more consequential. So the president's party in the U.S. House has had more elections with a net loss in seats than for the Senate, but the Senate averages more losses as a percentage of seats that they held compared to the House. So it kind of depends on how exactly you look at it. And because there are more seats in the House, the number of House seats that are lost can be more stark than if you're looking at it through the lens of the Senate. But for more specific instances in U.S. history, because there are quite a few noteworthy midterm results, and a few of them are because they happen to buck the trend of the president's party not doing well. But we're going to focus more on the times where the sitting president's party lost seats, because that is a lot more common. And so the biggest Democratic loss in midterm history was back in 1894, where Democrats lost 116 seats in the House, which was the biggest loss for a party in a midterm ever. And they lost 5 seats in the Senate. So this is when the U.S. Senate was still chosen by state legislatures. That wasn't until about 20 years later that was changed so that we directly elected U.S. senators. And at the time, President Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, who was the first president to win non-consecutive terms in office until Donald Trump just did it back in 2024. He returned to the White House in 1892. He had actually won the popular vote in the previous presidential election. He just didn't win the electoral vote. But during that term, there was a severe depression. There was a railroad strike, obviously back when railroads were a lot more economically important. And a giant swath of jobless workers went to D.C. to demand relief. And obviously, the party in power was blamed there, which in this case was Democrats, and it was the president. And so Democrats lost massively. But then on the flip side, the biggest Republican loss in a midterm ever was back in 1874, so 20 years before that Democratic loss, where Republicans lost 96 seats in the House and 9 in the Senate. And this was following financial panic and concerns over post-Civil War governance during the Reconstruction era. And one of these fronts, if you will, where you saw this was there was internal strife within the Republican Party, about how to deal with the Democratic South. Some were more, not conciliatory, but some of them were more like, we should ease them back into the Union, and if they reaffirm their allegiance to the country, we won't be as harsh on them, while other Republicans said, no, we have to deal with them harshly. They were the ones who started this war. We need to basically tell them what's what. And so a lot of that internal strife led to a much less cohesive Republican Party. So Democrats were able to take advantage of that. And also Democrats were just regaining power in the South again and building it back up until they retained their pre-war. You could even argue that they became even stronger after the Civil War in the South after Reconstruction. And then you saw the institution of Jim Crow laws. And then, so Democrats then in 1874 took advantage of that. But other monumental swings in midterm elections include 1938, 1994, and 2010 for Democrats. 1938 was a backlash to some of the New Deal policies under FDR. Some people felt that he was overstepping his bounds. Obviously, some people did not think that. 1994 was sort of that buildup of Republicans starting to gain some steam in the South, partially because of what we saw starting in the 1960s, what a lot of people call the Great Sorting Out, as the parties became a lot more distinct, where Republicans became more and more conservative, Democrats became more and more liberal, and a lot of those staunch Democrats in the South felt that the party was leaving them, and then they were eventually drifting over to the Republican Party, and so the Republicans made those gains in the South that now seem very, what's the big deal? Of course, Republicans are very strong in the South. Back at that time, that was something that was completely unheard of. And so that was during the time of Bill Clinton. And so Republicans took power in 1994. And that's kind of not really ushered in, but it finally really set the stage for this level of hyper polarization that we see today, which was really building up since the 1960s. And then in 2010, Democrats lost a lot of seats as well, in large part because of this Tea Party wave in the Republican Party. And not just at the federal level, but Republicans also took control of a lot of state legislatures as well. And even now, Republicans tend to have the advantage in state level governments. And then on the Republican side, some other monumental swings that went against them, those previous ones were for Democrats, but others that went against the Republican Party were 1958 during Eisenhower's tenure. Even though a lot of people they liked Ike, they did not feel quite as much the same way about his party. 1974, they suffered significant losses under Ford, a lot of it in response to Richard Nixon and the Watergate scandal. And then in 2018 for Donald Trump. And so perhaps we'll see another swing against Donald Trump in this election cycle. We'll talk more about that later. But in general, indicators of what will happen in midterm elections. What do we use to indicate what will happen in midterm elections, or at least predict? Obviously, history is a prominent guide for that, but what else can give us an indication of how a midterm is going to go? And there's a lot of different factors that different people use to make their arguments, but using any data point by itself and alone, that's not necessarily going to be predictive. In fact, you're going to be you're likely going to be led astray if you only use one specific thing. And more on that on these specific factors. But let's talk about those right now. First of all, let's talk about the generic congressional poll or generic congressional ballot. This is a polling question where people are asked without names, simply, would you vote for a Republican or a Democrat in Congress today? So, doesn't matter who is on the ballot, just would you vote Democrat or would you vote Republican? And so this is useful for general sentiments towards the parties, and partisan identification is still the strongest predictor of how someone will vote, but some people will still like their specific congressperson, that incumbency advantage, which we'll also get into shortly. But you have to be careful with using the generic congressional poll. Yes, it's very useful for finding the sentiment against these parties in general, but these polls tend to poll from people across multiple congressional districts and states. So you're polling people from a bunch of different election scenarios, or maybe you're just happening, even if you're doing it random sampling, you might just happen to be polling a bunch of people from a very staunch Republican district or a very staunch Democratic district. And also the fact that we can only vote on the House member who represents our district or a Senate member who represents our state. So just because there's a certain percentage of people that would vote for a Democrat or a certain percentage of people who vote for a Republican, that doesn't mean it's going to neatly apply across the board. Generic congressional poll is not a clean one-to-one application of how the next Congress will look. So if Democrats are polling at 52% in a generic congressional poll, that doesn't mean they're going to win 52% of the seats in the House, because it depends on where those people are being pulled from. Maybe you just happen to have more Democrats from a smaller cluster of Democratic districts, or you might be doing that for the Republican Party. Even if you're doing it random sampling and it's a really good poll, you still have to be careful with where you're getting those people from. And also just the general idea of, that's what people are saying they'd vote for, but are they necessarily actually going to turn out to vote? They might be really energized right now, but are they going to be energized later? And it's also harder to apply generic congressional polls to the U.S. Senate, since not every Senate seat is up, and a lot of times the election conditions for a Senate seat are much different than a district, because you're representing a whole state versus a specific district, and you're also having a lot more people voting on a Senate seat compared to a House seat, not just because typically there are more people being represented by that senator versus a House member. People also tend to care about the Senate a bit more than they do for the House representatives. So there's going to be more people voting on the Senate anyways. But when combined with some of these other factors, generic congressional ballots can help us predict what's going to happen in the midterm. And speaking of those other factors, we also have presidential approval rating. So you've seen them before. You ask people, do they approve of the way that the president is handling his job, yes or no? Or it'll be a similar question to that. With how nationalized elections have become, which is to say that more elections are placed in the context of what is happening nationally instead of locally. And that's not just for Congress. You're seeing that for governor. You're seeing that for state legislatures. You're even seeing it for local level races, where it's a litmus test of, do you like the current president? Do you support the current president? Which invites a lot of problems on its own, but that's a discussion for a different topic. And so the approval or disapproval of the president can have a tremendous impact on congressional voting, because it's in that context of, oh, wait, this guy, this lady, he or she are the same party as the president. I like the president. I'm going to vote for them. Oh, they're in the same party as the president. I don't like him. I'm not going to vote for this person. You're seeing a lot more of that kind of thought process amongst voters because of this nationalization of elections. And especially because members of Congress have more staunchly hitched their wagon to or against the president's party as the years go on. But it can still run into the same problems that the generic congressional polling can, because you might be taking public opinion from you are taking public opinion from across a bunch of districts and states. So it doesn't neatly conform to the percentages of how Congress will shake out. So, just because 45% of people approve of the job that the president is doing doesn't mean that the president's party is going to win 45% of the seats. It really just depends on how those voters are divvied up across districts. Another factor that people use to indicate how a midterm election will play out is they'll point to the special elections since the last presidential election. And these are often treated as quote unquote bellwethers to signal what's going to come in the midterm election. And I'm not typically a fan of that. Now, such special elections do tend to go more against the sitting president, and that can be a signal of turbulence for the president's party. But I've talked about this before, I get kind of annoyed when I hear people treat individual special elections as bellwethers of what's going to come. Like this one seat in, I don't know, North Carolina, or this one seat in Nevada is going to indicate what's going to happen. That alone is going to be an indication of what's going to happen in the midterm for the president. No, vast majority of these elections are for districts. So these districts are a lot more localized. Their effects are more contained. So it's difficult, if not impossible, to extrapolate for the rest of the country. And also, most places will not have any sort of special election between the presidential election and the midterm election. So you aren't getting the sentiments of the whole country. So admittedly, I get very annoyed by hearing special elections being, oh, is this a bellwether? No, it's not. And now, if you take these special elections together, now that might give you a bit more of a sense of what's going to happen. But you still have a lot of places that are not having special elections. So there's sometimes an over-reliance on those to indicate, oh, this is what's going to clearly happen in a midterm. And also, it's partly sensationalization to draw more engagement from people, so that you've got people's interest piqued in what's going on in politics. So admittedly, not a fan of that factor, but I'm not going to say that it's not useful, because it can be when it's used in tandem with multiple other factors, like economic factors. Now, it's a bit simplistic, but there is some truth to the old saying, it's the economy. Economic factors are going to have a major impact on what people or how people vote. Probably not as much as the party identification is going to, but it's still going to have a pretty impactful effect. And sometimes it may draw people to vote against the party that they typically identify with. And you also see many voters, what we call retrospective voters, will vote against the party in power if their pocketbook is not doing well. And then some people might do it if they perceive that their group that they identify with, whether it's a geographic group or a racial group or a group in an industry, like their specific career sphere, if they perceive that that whole industry is not doing well, that may influence their vote as well. But it's not just about whether the economy is doing well by more objective, for lack of a better term, standards, but whether certain voters think it is doing well, because these perceptions are going to vary for people. I can talk to two different people right now, and they can have it can be a similar social class, they can be a similar job, and some of them one is going to think that the economy is terrible, and one is going to think that the economy is doing well. One could have a more positive view, while the other one has a more negative view, even though they have otherwise very similar characteristics. And some of that is going to be driven by party. A lot of people, if their party's in power, they will perceive the economy as doing better than maybe it is. And then some people who identify with the party that's not the president's may perceive the economy as doing worse than it actually is. Both sides can be biased in that regard. But another factor that a lot of people use to try to predict how a midterm election is going to shake out in general is you look at the incumbents who are retiring from office. Now, it's easy to rag on politicians for being out of touch with citizens, and to some extent, that is justified, and maybe sometimes we overblow it. Admittedly, I can do that too. But politicians often know when the winds of elections are really against them. And sometimes, maybe even often, they respond by just simply retiring, especially if they're in the U.S. Senate, because the only higher office in that case would be for president. But if they really think that elections are not going to go their way, they may just say, screw it, I'm not even going to run for re-election. I'm just going to call it a career. Now, it's not always the sitting president's party in midterms that does it. There are both Democrats and Republicans this year that are retiring, but you often see more of them decide to retire in midterms, and you tend to see it in the sitting president's party because midterms tend to go against the sitting president's party. Now, sometimes they decide to run for a different office that they think they have a better chance at. But for this context, I'm just talking about the retirements because of the indication of a bellwether, or not the bellwether, excuse me, indication of what might happen in midterms overall. So you can look at these retirements because people may just say it's not worth it, I'm going to lose anyways, or it's almost definite that I'm going to lose, and so they won't even try. And you also have to account for the incumbency factor. The incumbency advantage is very well documented, and sitting office holders in Congress often win upwards of 85%, 90% of the time. But if those incumbents are retiring, then that incumbency advantage is gone. They might not, a lot of times, they won't think that incumbency advantage is going to help them this time. Now, some of them are just older and or tired of the job of Congress, but a lot of times it is because the winds of the election are going against them. So they may think that the incumbency advantage is not going to save them this time. And the generic sentiments towards Democrats and Republicans, like you see in these generic congressional ballots, may become more pronounced in how impactful they are on those elections, because now it's an open seat. There's not a Republican or a Democrat holding it because that person is retiring. And in the past decade or so, we've tended to see more incumbents retiring in midterm years than they were in presidential or midterm years. And then one last factor I'll highlight that a lot of people use to get an indication of how a midterm is going to go for the sitting president's party. By no means is this an exhaustive list, but some people look at what's called the policy mood measure, or the Stimson measure. And this is named after political scientist James A. Stimson, who has been publishing these statistics for decades now, so he's still going at it. And it tracks short-term and midterm variations in whether the population wants more or less government action on various issues. So if there's higher scores, it means people have a more liberal sentiment and they want more active government. If there are lower scores, it means it's more conservative and they want less active government. The higher and lower scores don't have any meaning on their own. It's not like higher is better, lower is better. It's just a spatial way to describe how much one way or another the general public is about a particular policy. Though using this to predict midterm results depends partly on how voters perceive these candidates' positions on these issues, and some candidates will purposely obfuscate certain aspects of their positions or their policies if they think that it's not going to play well with their voter base, but it's still something they strongly believe in. And also, a lot of voters don't think ideologically, or they focus on only one or a few specific policies and not all of those policies in the Stimson measure. A lot of people don't necessarily think in conservative or liberal terms. They might think about the specific policies, which is related but not exactly the same. But they don't necessarily see things as conservative or liberal. So if the mood is more liberal, they won't necessarily be like, oh, okay, I'm voting for the liberal person. Or if it's a more conservative mood, they won't necessarily go, okay, I'm voting for the conservative person. They don't necessarily think in those terms. And a lot of these people aren't using the Stimson measure to decide how they should vote. But it can still be a useful way to determine which way the wind blows in terms of which party is going to benefit. But again, one measure alone is not necessarily that informative. But if you use a bunch of these factors or all of them, it starts to give you a clearer idea of what you could expect overall from a midterm. And you see some political scientists and observers, they'll use a comprehensive measure that says, okay, on these 10 points, these 12 points, these 14 points, which party is benefiting from this? Or which president, and if it's a presidential election, they'll say which presidential candidate is benefiting from this. And then they'll use that to determine, like, oh, if the sitting president's party is losing on 7 of these measures, they're going to lose the midterm. That sort of thing. So you can find a few of those. I'm forgetting what some of these specific ones are off the top of my head, but you do see some political scientists and observers and commentators use these kinds of measures, these comprehensive measures, to try to determine whether a midterm is going to go, not necessarily whether a midterm is going to go against the sitting president's party, but how much it's going to go against the sitting president's party. Because remember, it's a midterm. Chances are it's not going to work out well for the sitting president's party. But now let's bring this to this year's elections. What are some of the potential biggest influences and impacts on the 2026 midterm elections? Well, in pretty much every election, political party identification is generally the strongest indicator of how people are going to vote. And second place isn't all that close. Second place is maybe economic factors, generally speaking. And it can vary depending on the contest in question. You might find one U.S. House race where the party identification factor isn't all that important, or it's not nearly as important as it is for a lot of other places. And it's more economic factors. Again, every race has its own contexts, its own things to deal with. But at the end of the day, most Republicans will vote Republican and most Democrats will vote Democrat. And you can be even very annoyed with your own party. A Democrat can have a lot of grievances with other Democrats. A Republican can have a lot of grievances with other Republicans. But still, a lot of times the we can't let the other side win mentality will prevail. A lot of times it will prevail. And some people will just think of it in the terms of what's the lesser of two evils kind of deal. But apart from that, lots of things can change in the time until an election, even when there's 4, 5, 6 months to go. Even 2 or 3 months, 1 month, there can be a sudden change. And there's often an assumption that more people pay close attention to politics than is actually the case. A lot of people don't start really paying attention until there's like 1, 2, 3 months out. And even for the people who are paying close attention, there could be changes in key issues or in their own personal lives that influence how they vote. They might not make a different choice for their vote, but something in their personal lives or in their thought processes that might change, that makes them less motivated to even go out to vote. So their vote might not change, but whether they actually go vote might change. And people may be energized to go out to vote now, but will they keep that energy up months later? A lot of people won't. So that's why you always have to be careful looking at when you ask. Sometimes polls will ask people, how excited are you to go vote? How motivated are you to go vote? How much are you looking forward to go vote? If you do that too far out and you hold on to that sentiment too much, people might burn out before the election's actually upon us. But will a single issue be what drives the midterms? Probably not. One issue might have outsized importance and might be the biggest issue, but you can almost never boil down an election to, it's because of policy views on this issue. A lot of times in commentary and analysis, people will say, well, this election was won because of this specific thing. No, it's pretty much never like that. That might be the biggest reason why an election happened that way, but there's a whole bunch of different factors at play that influence the election outcome. So one issue may have outsized importance, but it's never going to be one specific issue that totally dictates what happens, especially not across a ton of contests, for an overall midterm review. And some contests will care about certain issues more than others will. Some districts may care about immigration more than others do, or they may care about healthcare more than other places do, or the unemployment rate they'll care about more than other places because some places will have a higher unemployment rate than others. And whatever the salient issue is at the moment, that could be supplanted by a different one later. And while some voters may be very upset with their party about how they have handled one particular policy, is that necessarily going to lead them to vote a different way? Probably not, because they're still thinking about a lot of other policies that they may agree with their party on. But if they're angry enough, pissed off enough about the issue at hand, they might just sit at home instead. So they might not go, you know what? I'm a Democrat. I'm going to vote Republican. I'm a Republican. I'm going to vote Democrat. No, they may just say, I'm just not going to go. Or they may avoid a specific election, like a specific U.S. senator or U.S. House member, and maybe they'll vote on other things instead. But that being said, what are some of the issues that could make a major impact in the 2026 midterms? Obviously, redistricting is going to be impactful. But in what exact way? Because, yes, gerrymander maps by both Democrats and Republicans in their respective states are going to make more of their seats almost impervious to the opposing party or for the opposing party. But are the redistricting wars themselves going to influence people to vote a different way? Are Republicans going to go, you know what, I really don't like what we've been doing with redistricting, I'm going to vote Democrat? Or are Democrats going to look at what their party has done with the redistricting and say, you know what, I'm going to vote Republican, this is unacceptable? That's highly doubtful that either party is going to have a lot of their voters vote against their party for gerrymandering, especially since both parties are engaging in it. So it makes it easy to start engaging in whataboutism. Well, they're doing it, so you know what? It's not as big of a deal as if we do it. Or, you can feel like your conscience is safe because you're saying, well, both sides are doing it, so I'm still just going to stick with my party. My feelings about the current redistricting controversy going on and how both parties are engaging in gerrymandering, and I quite frankly don't care for any of the excuses made by either party there, but I don't think it's going to necessarily change a lot of people's minds. But it's going to obviously make some districts safer for both Democrats and Republicans. But what about the Iran war? Obviously, it's very important right now. As of the time of this episode, the war has been going on for a month and a half. But is this war going to last long enough to be part of the wider voting public's conscience? Remember, there's a lot of voters that are not paying attention to politics right now, or they do have an idea of what's going on, but are they going to completely forget about it when it comes to election time? Well, if gas prices continue to stay high and the prices of other goods are driven higher because of the higher cost to transport goods, that could hit Donald Trump and Republicans harder. Now, yes, presidents, both Democrat and Republican, are treated as if they set gas prices when they don't, or that they have a much more direct impact on gas prices than they actually do, but they still do have policies that can have a direct or indirect impact. Now, whether those policies are overall good or bad, I'm not getting into that. That's for you to decide. But however, rightly or wrongly, presidents are often blamed for gas prices. And people think that presidents specifically set the gas prices, which they don't. And if they did, I think they would set the gas prices much lower more often than they actually do. But there's also the fact that the U.S. is also engaged in yet another war, and it may be held against Donald Trump after calling for no more wars and not getting as involved in other countries' affairs while he was on the campaign trail. I'm not saying, my specific opinion on him, but that is going to be a lot of the calculus for a lot of voters, as they say, well, you said you weren't going to get involved in these things. So people may hold that against the party. Now, if the Iran war resolves itself soon and it's not as much of a problem and prices start going down, it may fade out of the conscience of a lot of voters. Certainly, the more engaged and highly partisan and ideological voters on both the Republican and Democratic sides, they're not going to forget their vote was already set in stone. There was nothing that was going to change their opinion anyways. And then lastly, immigration, because that is a key issue right now, of course, and it's likely going to continue to be a key issue as it has been for most, if not all, of Donald Trump's second term. It was one of the highlights of his platform, or one of the things that he highlighted on his platform. And a lot of the pushback over such policies, such as the response to the Minnesota protests or putting immigrants in camps in other countries like El Salvador or in the U.S., such as in Florida, those are probably not going away anytime soon because those policies are probably going to continue to be relevant come election time. Now, how much does that swing an election towards or against Democrats or towards or against Republicans? It's hard to say right now because we still have got many months before voting even starts. But I would assume that that is going to be another key issue for Donald Trump and the Republican Party. But there was also some support for Donald Trump based on his immigration stances on the campaign trail. So how much of that will still be around in this midterm? But of course, support for a president on any of their issues, on any of their stances, before they get a chance to implement the policies, can always shift when those policies actually happen. Because what a politician says is going to happen versus what actually does happen, there can be a lot of disparity in that regard. Whether they, went back on a promise or just something just happened to work out differently or there was an unintended consequence, there's all sorts of things that can change. So obviously, there's still going to be a lot of people that are still staunchly for Donald Trump because of those policy views, and there's still going to be some people that are staunchly against him because of those policy views and those policy effects. But again, a lot of those people were already set in stone whether or not they were going to vote for Donald Trump, and they'll be set in stone whether or not they vote for his party. But at the end of the day, though, it is a safe bet to assume that the sitting president's party is not going to have a fun midterm, because you just have to look at history and all the reasons why people do it, whether it's because they're, quote unquote, balancing a midterm against the president so that, whichever party the president is, they're just going to vote for the opposite party. Or if it's just simply because the president's not on the ballot this time, or the out party is angrier and more hateful this time, and it's both parties. Let's not act like it's one party or the other. Both parties engage in it. And so any one of those things can have a particularly potent effect on this year's elections. Now, how many seats would be lost by Republicans? You also have to account for the fact that Republicans in the U.S. House have a very thin margin, so even just losing a few seats can totally swing the majority in the favor of Democrats. And I'm forgetting exactly how many seats that are up in the Senate are held by Republicans right now. I'd have to look that up again. But that's part of the calculus too. How many Republican seats in the U.S. Senate are up for election? Now, they might still have a net loss in seats, but will they lose enough to lose the U.S. Senate? That's one of the big questions. But in any case, midterms, in this case, Donald Trump is a Republican. Republicans control Congress. And midterm history suggests that at least one of those chambers is going to become Democratic. If it's just one, it's almost definitely going to be the U.S. House. They might win the U.S. Senate as well. But in any case, Republicans should brace themselves. And so that is going to do it for today's episode of the Politics with Paul podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. for the podcast wherever you get them, on YouTube, on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts. Hopefully expand this to other podcast platforms in the near future. My links to the show notes, Facebook page, Paul Rader, author and speaker, LinkedIn profile, medium.com profile, my 5-day educational email course about how we can all more effectively mitigate polarization and toxicity, my website, paulrader.org, my email, paulraderwrites@gmail.com, my book on Amazon about independence in elections, and I believe that's all of them. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.